Good afternoon, class. I'll get right down to business. Today we were talking about the emergence of, and please forgive this slide. In fact, I should have fixed this before I put this up, but that second objective should read, describe the characteristics of Hinduism as a universalizing religion and explain how it, I would say, reestablished India in the 4th through 7th centuries current era. Okay, so my apologies there. Continuing on here, I'm going to skip through some of the questions we had about our primary document that was assigned for today. And then we talked a little bit about the interesting and difficult position of China in the years following the fall of the Han Dynasty. It's going to go into about 350, almost 400 year, I guess we could say, tailspin of sorts. It's going to be much less centralized, much less stable, and much less culturally predictable. So we talked about some of the influences of things like Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and our document helped us to understand that Buddhism had been perceived as something of a foreign threat by the mid-first millennium current era. So when the Sui dynasty starts to form in the 600s current era, Buddhism is going to be one of the cultural influences that's increasingly questioned. So that's all well and good in the sense that it helps explain a little bit about the path of Buddhism out of India or South Asia and then into East Asia. We have lots of evidence to suggest that Buddhism will become a powerful cultural force in places like China, Korea, Japan, other parts of Central Asia, largely transported there by missionaries, by merchants, and then increasingly even by some of the nomadic, quote-unquote, barbarian peoples that come in contact with parts of Central and East Asia. But the story that I intended for today to be about was the story of the emergence, or I should say the re-emergence of Hinduism in India or South Asia. And to understand the story of Hinduism, we can really divide it into 3 separate stages. The first we'll refer to as the Vedic Era, and I would describe the Vedic period of the Hindu tradition as lasting from roughly 1500 BCE to about 600 BCE, so for almost 1,000 years. And the basic story here is that the earliest, the people who brought the earliest traces of what we might call the Hindu or Brahmin tradition to South Asia were the Aryans, which were initially a nomadic society of people. We have linguistic or language evidence to suggest that the Indo-Europeans, one group of which we will refer to as the Aryans, essentially originate in the plains or the steppe of Western Asia. And this is a fairly rich and important cultural origin because many Indo-European people are going to migrate to different parts of the world surrounding the steppe of Western Asia. And so the people of ancient Greece, many of the barbarians that we studied earlier in this chapter, people who were making life difficult for Rome by the 3rd, 4th century current era, many of these people are Indo-European by origin, and we know this because they speak a fairly similar language. Anyway, one branch of that Indo-European tree is going to grow south into South Asia, into what we refer to today as the Indian subcontinent. We'll refer to these people as the Aryans. And in the first chapter, we could call this the Hindu tradition 1.0, the Aryans brought with them an important source of cultural influence known as the Vedas. And the Vedas were orally kept at first. They were not written down. They were essentially hymns or epic poems that were spoken or sung and they were shared repeatedly amongst the Aryan peoples that migrated south, and they became a source of guidance, a source of cultural definition, and they were part cultural and also part religious, really. So in this first 1,000-year period, from roughly 1500, maybe a little earlier actually, BCE, to 600 BCE, the Vedic tradition was in place. And what's important to note about the Vedic tradition is that the Aryans brought with them what we will call Dharma. Dharma is spelled D-H-A-R-M-A. I think you'll see it on the next slide a little more clearly. But Dharma was essentially the law. And the law was contained within these Vedic hymns and these epic poems. And essentially what the Dharma consisted of were expectations that each member of Aryan society would follow. You see, the Vedas had within them also, pardon me, the outlines of a social hierarchy. We sometimes hear this when we talk about India referred to as the caste system, but really a better term for it is Varna. And Varna were like levels of social meaning or social significance. And the Dharma, the law or the laws in the Vedas, made clear to different levels of society what was expected of them. So for example, the top level of society, the Brahmin priests, were expected to conduct themselves and live in accordance with certain rules and guidelines for a good Brahmin priest. Similarly, the Kshatriya, which were the next Varna, the next level down, they were the warrior class, and it was expected that they would follow certain norms, certain guidelines, and not break those. Similarly, for the Shudra, the next level down. But the Vedas had Dharma or law for each of these levels of society. And for the first 1,000 years or so of the Aryans living in India or the Indian subcontinent, this was a fairly important organizing principle. The Brahmin priests who sort of practiced and were responsible, tasked with conducting, we'll call it Vedic cultural and religious practice, they engaged in a number of different sacrificial ceremonies. There's some suggestion that maybe in the earliest going this even involved human sacrifice, but it certainly involved animal sacrifice, and it was their task to sacrifice at the right times to the right gods, such that the gods would be placated or satisfied by the sacrifices, and such that life would be good and fare well for the members of Vedic society. Now, around the 6th century BCE, and again, we know that this was a time of, this was during the Axial Age. Around 6th century BC, some changes happen, and they are made known through the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are an early instance, and I'm sorry, I know my picture is blocking part of this, but it says Upanishads, commentaries on the Vedas, and then it says Brahmanic period. So from the 6th century BCE to about the 2nd century current era, we're going to have the second, sort of the Hindu tradition 2.0, and we could call this now the Brahmanic period, okay? The Upanishads were a written account of how good, law-abiding members of the Brahmanic tradition would conduct themselves. And we start to see a change. The emphasis becomes less upon priests and sacrifices, but now whereas animal sacrifice was given as an offering in forgiveness for the waywardness or the wrongfulness of the people, now the emphasis, due in part to the Upanishads and how they write and clarify and change, the nature of Brahmanic worship or devotion. Now the emphasis is upon depriving the self of comfort and ease and I guess we could say luxury and appetite. So you see here I have written down asceticism and yoga. What now starts to happen is the Brahmin priests are going to lose a little bit of their unique and exclusive role within the interpretation of religious conduct within Indian culture. And the emphasis will shift increasingly toward individual rejection of the niceties and appetites of this world. I'll bump ahead just a little bit. The third, so the Hindu tradition 3.0 is going to be what we actually can start to call Hinduism, beginning in the 2nd century. It should actually say 2nd century current era, not 2nd century BCE. And Hinduism will reassert itself following a few centuries of Buddhist influence and power. Behind my picture here it says, Hinduism emerges at Buddhism's decline in India circa the 2nd century, and again it should say CE, not BCE. Okay, so what are some of the central beliefs of Hinduism that are going to help it recover after it has lost out for a few centuries to Buddhism? Well, an important characteristic of the Hindu tradition is this idea of samsara. And samsara is the idea that we are all in a circle of life, that our lives take us around a wheel of life, and it's not our bodies that matter so much as our souls, and each incarnation, each life that the human lives on earth is a question of whether or not the soul has achieved its maximum health. And within the Hindu tradition, we've been introduced to this idea of Dharma, which is the law evident in the ancient Vedas. But what should be added here is that the way that the individual conducts him or herself, consistent with the Dharma of her or his role in society, that allows the individual to create karma, or to earn karma. And karma is essentially the recognition of one's relationship to other beings within the world community. So samsara, we continue to circle around this wheel of life, but if we are following the Dharma and we are doing what is expected of us, we are gaining karma. And karma is like it's like the rocket fuel that lifts us up into a higher level of existence in our next incarnation on Earth. Ultimately, what we are trying to do is escape the suffering of this world, and that third bullet up there, I guess, says moksha. Moksha is liberation from the cycle of life. Because if we keep living and we go around on our circles of life and we keep, through the accumulation of karma, coming back in a higher level soul, eventually we will escape the suffering of life in its entirety. And that is called moksha. And that, for much of Indian culture, is what the hope is. So karma is kind of the ultimate goal, and you do that by following the Dharma. Reincarnation is, hopefully, if you are properly following the series of positive developments, it's going to bring your soul back in a higher plane such that eventually you will be prepared to escape into moksha. I am going to stop here and save some comments for the beginning of class tomorrow. I'm sure there will be some questions about this, and I also want to make sure that we put the proper finishing touches on this. So thank you, and we will see you soon.